Okay. So I'm going to give a brief overview of where we're at with the density model, recap some of the information from our December workshop, and update you on where we're at with our reserve alternative. In February of 2016, staff submitted our application for the density model update. By our initial meetings with staff to review our current HCP in February of 2017, it had not been reviewed by management level staff and was still going through their process. In October of 2017, the Vero Beach office sent that up to the regional office in Atlanta and the solicitor's office for review. Currently, we are awaiting additional requests for information from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Once we receive that and address those issues, the next steps will be to go on the Federal Register for public comment. The service has to respond to all of those comments, create their statement of findings, and then they would notify us if it is approved or denied at that time. Excuse me. So the recap from our December workshop is the current HCP as it stands has some implementation challenges with regards to acquiring the reserve design. Because the reserve is static and there's a lack of flexibility, when we don't acquire parcels or parcels are developed, we don't have any alternatives currently to address those issues. There's lack of areas for the alternative parcels because the reserve design has a spatial component to it to connect some existing conservation lands that further limits any alternatives that we may have, and also the willing seller nature of the program. One of the alternatives staff brought at the board workshop was to acquire some agricultural lands that are directly adjacent to Prairie Creek Park and restore those to scrub habitat. The HCP itself does allow for alternative parcels. They have to be proposed to the service for their approval, but that was contemplated in the original plan. The areas that staff is recommending as an alternative parcel is approximately 1,300 acres of existing agricultural lands. Roughly 300 of those acres are wetlands, so we'd be looking at restoring just under 1,100 acres. When we account for the minimization requirements of the plan and the lands we've already acquired, that meets our total target for the plan of the 1,336 acres. However, the restoration and the additional acquisition cost comes to an additional $3.5 million over what our current HCP plan is contemplated for. Parcel A, which is the yellow parcel, is 702 acres. We'd be looking to purchase that fee simple. This has the potential opportunity for a gopher tortoise recipient site sometime in the future once it's been restored. Parcel B, we are looking at purchasing a conservation easement of 640 acres. This provides both the needed acreage and the connectivity to get us to our total amount of acreage for the alternative. To date, we have done legal descriptions on both of the proposed parcels and have had appraisals of each parcel. We are currently updating the one for the conservation easement. We had originally had that appraised at a fee simple cost. We have worked with the attorney's office and the property owner for the terms of what that conservation easement would look like with regards to our management of the site and what rights they would retain. And we've prepared a cash flow for how we would implement that over the next 15 years. The financial considerations are the anticipated cost of acquisition and then the restoration. Restoration of impacted habitat is much more expensive than restoration of just poor, unmanaged habitat, which is what our plan initially contemplated. So that's where some of that extra cost comes in. We provided the fiscal department with our proposed cash flow with the current funding allocations and how that would balance out to that total additional cost of $3.5 million. Our next steps, if we pursue this, would be to formally submit to the service for their approval of this as an alternative parcel. Then we would work with the fiscal department to define a funding mechanism for both the alternative parcel and the restoration, and then we would bring that back to you all for purchase. That's it.
That's where we are.
Mr. Chairman? I have a few questions, if I may. This is mandated by the feds that we do this. Is that not so?
The HCP,
Yeah, we're required to do that, right?
property owners are required to comply with the Endangered Species Act. The Habitat Conservation Plan is one option.
Okay. About how many acres do we have in the scrub jay habitat saved area, reserved area now? About?
Just under 4,800 acres.
Okay. And about how many birds would you guess live in Charlotte County?
We have not done a survey since we initially started the plan in 2009, and at that time we had, I want to say close to 80 families, but I would need to verify that.
Okay. So even if we said 100 families, thinking that maybe, I mean, I don't know if we have any, you'd be the person that know, because you're the guy that counts them. I mean, would you say 100 families or 60 or 70, or it would just be an absolute guess? We don't know.
It would be, I have that information, it would just be a guess.
I'm going to say 100 families, and I don't know how big the average scrub jay family is, but let's say they've got 3 kids or 2 kids, or so we got like, what, 400 birds plus or minus? And we've got almost 5,000 acres, and we've spent $3.5 million so far.
No. We've only spent...
Well, you're projecting to spend $3.5 million additional over 30 years.
Correct. An additional $3.5 million.
And how much have we spent so much?
On land acquisition, we've spent around $250,000.
Okay, that's not so bad, because they could all have their own lot. I just, you know, we years ago, we went through these discussions, and I guess I just find it frustrating that we have to tie up so much land, and we have to spend so much money on this. And it's sort of like an unfunded mandate by the feds, in my mind. And you know, I appreciate our environment. I appreciate this beautiful place we have. Biblically, I thought, you know, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and the animals are here to serve us. So I really don't have anything against the birds. I just think that, and I know you're doing your job, but I just get frustrated by this whole process and what we have to go through. Do we have any alternative?
To our HCP, the HCP is really just an option for citizens that was put together at the board's direction to help alleviate some of the financial constraints that were previously in place. When permitting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service directly prior to our HCP, the mitigation for a quarter-acre lot ranged anywhere from $13,000 to $69,000. So that was really the impetus to enter into this permit.
I haven't done the math. It's been in the back of my mind, but I'm just wondering, when we go through this whole process, what does that cost get down to when we include what the county spent and trying to assist, you know, the local property owners in terms of what I believe is their constitutional right of self-determination on their property? Where do we go from here?
The current HCP as it stands, the total cost over 30 years is approximately $56 million. When the financial summary was done during the initial analysis of the plan, without the HCP, cost to individual citizens could range anywhere from $200 to $400 million based on those individualized mitigation costs.
Chris is probably doing the math in his head, but I'm going to tell you, Chris, we could get them really nice condos on the water for much less money. I just get frustrated. I had to share it. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Mr. Tiseo.
Yeah, I think a lot of my comment was just cleared up by staff. I just want to make sure it was clear the HCP was not a mandate from the federal government.
Right.
That was something the board put together for the to offset the cost you just mentioned. If individual lot owners tried to do it on their own, it would be much more expensive. So that I just want to be clear that wasn't the HCP itself was not a mandate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Truex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to kind of further clarify, there were 18,000 lots that were basically deemed not buildable because of the cost and the process that they would have to go through in the timeline. 14,000 of those quarter-acre lots are now considered buildable, affordable to build. It's the other 4,000 parcels that we're trying to, I think, justifiably bring into some affordability range for them to be able to do what they have a right to do, and that's to develop the property or utilize their property. This problem came up when you take a look at a 10-acre parcel and somebody had an exorbitant six-figure fee to pay to put a house on it because you're impacting the 10 acres. I think a 5-acre parcel was $67,000.
$76,000.
$76,000. Thank you. So, the point is that yes, it's not something that we had to do, but actually, my opinion is it was the best things for the citizens to do to give them their rights back, because I looked at this as almost a taking the way it was done, and I think we're going about it in a very good way. I had a very good meeting with staff yesterday on some of my concerns moving forward. But I believe that this is the best method by which we can serve our citizens by providing them the rights that I think they should have, as well as trying to maintain the bird in perpetuity as we've been somewhat deemed responsible for doing. And, this is going to create the connectivity, the continuity that we're going to have for them to have the potential for success. So, and I thank staff for your information yesterday.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think I'm going to weigh in here.
Go ahead.
I think that, first of all, you nailed it. I mean, the situation is the Threatened and Endangered Species Act is not going to change. It's Congress. So the key right now is to maybe have a parallel course on working on that, long term, take years. But also we have a need to revise this current fee schedule, in my opinion, in the current HCP. The 4,000 properties that are larger, because the current methodology is based on acreage, is just unaffordable. A 5-acre piece of property in Prairie Creek Park can only put one home on that, but instead of the $2,200 that you would spend in Deep Creek on a 1/4-acre lot, you have to spend $76,000 in Prairie Creek Park. That's just not right. So we got 4,000 properties that are really needing some help. Now, we're in a modification of the permit right now for the fee schedule. What's happened is that the service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife in Atlanta, I guess, started looking at the ramifications of what would happen if increased building activity would take place in Prairie Creek Park, as an example, which is very good habitat. Habitat varies in quality. And they started questioning all that. And we had a good meeting in Washington with the lady that actually worked on the permit when she was based in Vero Beach, Miss Adams. It's very unusual to be in Washington, D.C. with a federal regulator and they know where Deep Creek is and they know where Prairie Creek Park is. So it was very, very good from that perspective. But it's quite clear to me that this request for a fee schedule modification is only going to occur if we incorporate in it what we're going to do as far as Plan B on the alternative reserve. So basically, we're kind of in that place right now. And I wanted to clarify one other thing. Was it 25 years as a review? At 25 years, if we have not acquired the property, at some point, doesn't a potential moratorium take place for all of the properties within the HCP?
Yes. At every 2 years, year 2, 4, 6, and then every 5 years thereafter, the percentage of building permits has to equal the percentage of land that we've acquired.
Otherwise, they'll shut us down.
Correct. Then we would have to stop issuing
all
permits.
18,000 properties would then not be allowed to build.
Until we catch up on that acquisition side, so they're...
And I saw that when we had the workshop in December. There's a real benefit to taking in this, I think it was option 3 that you had back in December, where we would acquire all of the property at one time and get it done. Just get it done. And that allows us to move ahead. How we would do it financially, we need some help from Mr. Sandrock, but I support moving ahead with it for the sake of those 4,000 properties. I just don't see any other alternative. Commissioner Deutsch.
I know at one time, the last time I checked, no other county had taken, as aggressive move as we have. Has anyone else? And at one point, we were the model for the state of Florida to do this. Has anyone else moved ahead in this direction that you know of? And
Sarasota County is starting to reevaluate and do the data collection to determine if they want to move ahead.
no one else has
Correct.
gone where we've gone in terms of helping our citizens out. Wow. All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Constance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where's the $3.5 million going to come from?
Well, that's what we haven't decided yet. It was $5 million in December, correct?
Correct. When we did the initial calculations, we did it based on the total acreage. Once we got the appraisals back and had the acreage of the wetlands that we wouldn't be able to restore to scrub, we backed that out, and that reduced that restoration cost.
Commissioner, I think ultimately it will be coming out of the HCP fund, paying back wherever we initially get the source of money from. In other words, the people that will be pulling building permits within the HCP will eventually pay back all of it.
How much have we seen since we started this program? How much in fees have we collected?
Our most recent update was in February, I believe, and we have collected over $800,000 so far.
So far the math's not working. When are we doing the next bird count?
The full county survey is not due until year 10, so that would be 2025.
And we're doing it because that's when it's mandated to do it, or what does it cost to do one of those?
A full countywide survey ranges between $30,000 and $60,000.
All right, let me ask this very difficult question. Do we think there are more birds or less birds out there? Because if we're gaining birds, I want to count tomorrow, because that's going to adjust everything, because that we're basing everything we're doing on how many families were counted an age ago. Okay, we have no idea where we stand now. And if it's half the number, then this plan is going to cost us $112 million because $112 million because we're going to have to double the amount of land and jack up the permit prices and make all those adjustments, because we're not taking that into account. And at the end of the day, I am just more than fed up with this whole process. This is a federal unfunded mandate. In my estimation, this is completely unconstitutional, because I really don't believe Congress holds sway over us with these matters anymore. I really don't. I think we need to be questioning this whole process and this whole thing with all the other things that we're being told to do by the federal government at a time when all of these rules were set up where you could go to your congressman and say, hey, we can't afford this. And they'd say, no problem. I'll get you an earmark. We'll get you the money to do the program. That's gone. The system has changed. And I don't think I'm just not in favor of playing ball anymore. So I'm more than frustrated.
Mr. Tiseo.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that frustration. I mean, having to deal with folks up in Washington with issues we have here locally doesn't seem to work in many instances, to put it lightly. But we have gone down this road, and we have followed, I guess, we created the HCP, we submitted it for approval, we willingly put this plan together as a board, and I think if we didn't want to deal with Washington, we should have never submitted the HCP in the first place. So we are where we are today. We have to deal with the reality that we have to navigate through the regulatory agencies. As much as we'd like to wave a magic wand and change it, that's not going to help us now with homeowners waiting to pull permits, pay fees, and move ahead. So, I mean, I do understand the angst, but we still have to deal with what we have, and we do have a viable plan possibly to deal with now. I'm not sure if those bird counts, you know, how the details of the permit work, where we constantly have a moving target and we have to adjust. I assume there's a mechanism in that plan maybe to address that.
When we do the countywide surveys every 10 years, we do not have to adjust. As those numbers decline, that is what our overall plan and reserve design are mitigating for. They are mitigating for that design. So unless there's an unforeseen circumstance, they will not require additional acreage as those surveys show a decline in birds. It is expected as the development occurs outside the reserve design that those bird numbers will go down. They are relatively longer-lived bird, between 10 to 15 years, which is why they put that in the plan for every 10 years, because we won't really see a whole lot of impact 4, 5, 6 years in. And primarily the impact we're going to see is less reproductive success. So we're not going to see really significant impacts probably until year 15 or 20 with regards to that population decline, because they'll continue to reproduce, but instead of having 3 or 4 fledglings, they'll have 1, maybe 2. So then you'll see the overall numbers start to decline, but because they're more of a long-lived species, it's not as quickly realized.
And I appreciate that clarification. Also, in terms of the funding, you mentioned $800,000 in the fund. Have you done a schedule with the velocity of permits on what that number, how that may change going forward?
We have done some general estimations, but with the market the way it is and building permits, it's really hard to predict. We're estimating that at our current acquisition abilities, if we didn't pursue, we would be looking at year 2024 or 2025 where we would run out of land outside of Prairie Creek Park to acquire when we would hit that ratio threshold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Commissioner Constance?
Thank you. So do we have an idea? Do you think the populations are declining? Can we do any sort of a spot count? And even how is a count done? Can you explain that to me? How do you do a county-wide bird count looking for 80 birds or 150 birds?
So we initially build off of existing data where we know birds are. We start in those areas and then fan out. Scrub jays are very territorial, so during their mating season, if you go in and play a scrub jay call, they will respond to defend their territory. So that's how the scrub jays logistically surveys are logistically done. So we do that throughout. We know that their territories shift, so we start where we know they have been, and then we fan out from there to see if they have expanded, and then we do full family counts for each area.
Why are you supposing that the fledgling count will go down? What about, I mean, I guess we're turning into biologists here, but what is it about the birds that they determine they're not going to have as many? I mean, the food sources are the same.
As development occurs, they lose a lot of their primary food sources. So you go from a lot of native habitat to grass, where the quality of nutrients and food habitat declines. There was a study done by FWC before and after Hurricane Charlie with regards specifically in Deep Creek, where we have our most suburbanized population. And they have just seen steady declines as more development occurs, specifically in Deep Creek. The number of fledglings in each family goes down. That was a very intensive study. They banded birds, so they knew specific birds where they were and tracked their locations. And so that's where that information starts to come from.
Has anybody studied the toxic effect of bird banding? I'm just kidding. Thank you.
Commissioner Deutsch.
As happens on occasion, Chris, you a little bit more eloquently expressed my concern with your remarks, because, and by the way, we spent, when Chris and I first came on the board, we spent lots of time, as you know, on the scrub jay thing, and it frustrates me, and I think, the important thing here is, we took this move to try and assist and support the residents of the county, and we were way out in front of everyone else at that time. If we would have any inkling or indication that the population has increased, I think it would be in our best interest to initiate a count for the 30,000, because ultimately those numbers seem to be real easy if we could cut the amount of land that would be required to put into the program. But I take it from what you said, you really doubt that that's the case.
I would not expect to see an increase in population, but without those surveys and data, that's just my assumption based on knowing their biology and family cycles.
I accept your expertise at that, because that's another dimension of what frustrates me about that, because, if we had a shot that it was somewhat more than it was, I'd say, let's spend that $30,000 and because it could benefit us. And, I'm just frustrated by this because of what it costs, and I'm trying to relate the direct benefit to the dollars we have to expend and the time and effort that staff and we spend on this, and just find it very frustrating.
I understand, Commissioner. I mean, I don't think anyone on the board is pleased with this. I think we're all frustrated with the environmental permitting requirements from the federal government and in the state of Florida, for that matter, too. I mean, we run into it all the time, whether it's mitigation for hard bottom out off Minnesota Key or it's scrub jay habitat. No matter what, it's some sort of habitat. But what I want to do right now is move this item along. And Mr. Sandrock, I think we need some idea, though, as a board, how we find the front money, recognizing ultimately the HCP fund, people that will pull building permits will pay that back eventually over the next 30 years. What would be the funding source to acquire this land and get the ball rolling on basically restoration of that ag land into scrub jay habitat? What would we do? What could we do? What are the options?
As you know, Commissioners, funding sources are rather limited.
Mm-hmm.
I would think it would be the general fund reserves.
And that wouldn't be all out at one time either, correct?
Correct.
We have to acquire, then we begin the restoration process. I think it's going to be important to understand what that cash flow requirement will be, too, as part of this. And again, I'm assuming a lot of this will be incorporated in the modification to the modification of the HCP. In other words, we're in a mod right now for the fee schedule. Now we're going to modify the modification to add basically this alternative, if the board so chooses to do that this morning. Go ahead, Commissioner Tiseo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to the restoration, who's the final arbiter on whether or not that restoration is acceptable?
What we have built into our cash flow is the development specifically of a restoration plan, to have that contracted out to do that with the service, so they have buy-in at the front before we start investing in any restoration.
Okay, so the Fish and Wildlife Service will be involved, so there's no chance we spend money, they come back and say, well, guess what? This isn't the type of habitat we envisioned.
Yes, that is our...
We'll know up front that when we spend the money, they're going to accept this thing.
That is the direction we would like to go.
Yeah, well, I just want to make sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Commissioners, what's your pleasure? We've got to give staff some direction one way or the other on this thing, whether we move ahead with what I still call, I guess, option 3 from the December workshop. It's essentially that, correct? Or we do something different.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we go in this direction with quote-unquote option 3, obtaining some type of surety from the service that in doing so that our density model will be approved as long as the continuity is acceptable to them before we spend the money, and identify further the funding needed over time.
Second.
Okay, a motion to accept and a second to...
Complicated enough?
I think we can resurrect that off the tape, sir. Motion is second to move ahead with the alternative reserve for the HCP as outlined by staff this morning and as was outlined back in the December workshop. Any discussion? Commissioner Deutsch.
I just wonder if President Trump knows about the scrub jay thing. I think he would love talking about it.
Mr. Chairman, we could fill him in on that discussion if he would like, because we did meet with his Director of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Yes, we did.
So they're made aware.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say no. Hearing none, it passes unanimously. No. Oh, no, I didn't hear you, sir. 4-1. You voted no? I didn't hear you either. 3-2 in favor of the motion. Okay? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair,
I didn't hear it.
if I could request that we go back to R1.
Okay.